Hello, JFL here from JFL.com, and you're very welcome to Body, Mind, Self, live every Thursday evening at 8 p.m. GMT, or wherever you happen to be checking in from. And we focus on perception, presence, and control, and all the other fun stuff that you send in. So do remember you can send in topics using the comment section, hashtag bodymindself on social media or at jfl.com. And this evening's topics include competition. Is competition healthy? Is it something that inspires us to do better, or can it have the opposite effect? Can it just create undue pressure? We look at that. The idea of a middle path in Eastern philosophy. From a therapeutic perspective, is that a useful construct to use in thinking about how to make the right decisions and how to progress things moving forward? The idea of inner wisdom. It would seem, if we've been around for a while, have accumulated some knowledge, some wisdom, but sometimes we can't quite see it. We can't quite kind of quantify or identify it. So we look at some ways of approaching that. And also being honest. On the surface, honesty seems like a great idea, but can it backfire? Can we be too honest? And can that cause problems? How to go about being honest in ways that make it actually work in a beneficial way. So do send in your topics and your questions, and do share your experience. If you find the topics today valuable, please do like, subscribe, and share. And using the comment section, you can share your experience or hashtag bodymindself on social media or at jfl.com. Do share your experience. It's always fascinating to hear. Everyone's different, so get inspired hopefully by these ideas, but do get your own individual advice and support when it comes to applying some of these ideas to your life. What works really well for one person may or may not be a fit for another person, so do get whatever support you need. But I hope you find these ideas to be really useful jumping off points in terms of looking at direction and options moving forward. All right, so before we jump into some topics, let's take a moment to simply stop. Now, if you don't have a moment to stop, no problem. Carry on, do what you need to do, but maybe at a later point you'll be able to check back in. But if you do have a moment, your attention isn't needed anywhere else, you might like to just stop and drop the shoulders a little bit and just take a moment to breathe in, and at your own pace to just release your breathing out. And just to allow it to become a little bit more comfortable. To allow your breathing to feel a little bit more at ease. And just to almost to shift the camera angle of your attention from pointing completely out, just to back a little bit more. So rather than just experiencing the world through your body, you're feeling a bit more centered in your body. And you can still be aware of everything that you happen to be aware of. Whatever's going on around you is still there. Up in the head, any thoughts that are figuratively passing through the mind, absolutely fine. You can still be aware of all of that. But you're just feeling that feeling of shifting the angle a little bit. So you're just kind of stepping back into yourself a little bit more. And you might want to just notice how you're feeling physically. There's no right or wrong way to be feeling, but you might want to let the muscles relax a little bit. Not that you're trying to bring in relaxation, that will happen if it's appropriate, but you're just creating space for it, a little bit of room. And you might feel a feeling which is something like a car being in neutral. You have the option to take it forward in any number of directions, but there's no necessity, there's no compulsion. There's just a bit of breathing room and a bit of space. All right, do enjoy that room, enjoy that space, and let's look at some topics. Is competition healthy? On one hand, it's easy to see the appeal of competition. It gets us in gear, it maybe gives us a bit of motivation. Sometimes we push ourselves that bit more when we're trying to achieve something. So these are competitive advantages. On the other hand, though, we can see that it can be a problem. It can create pressure. Sometimes it can create judgment as well. If there's a winner, does that mean there's a loser? And that doesn't sound very nice. So there can be a bit of a dichotomy there when thinking about competition. So I suppose if we're looking for a quick answer to whether competition is healthy or not, a quick answer could be yes, if we're treating it as a game. And I think that's the big caveat there. Because where it becomes a problem is if we're not treating it as a game, and we may not be treating it as a game for one reason because we didn't choose to play the game. So sometimes it's just non-consensual. You know, somebody's trying to take from us and they go, I'm winning. And you go, well, I didn't know it was a game to begin with. I didn't even know it was a competition. I'm just trying to do my thing and I want to be left alone. So that issue of consent is one particular issue. But even if it is something that we're choosing to do, even if we're competing, like we're competing with others, or we're even competing with ourselves or our own goals and ambitions, still sometimes we haven't chosen necessarily the mode that we want to approach that competition in. We feel this feeling of having to be at a particular place, of having to achieve a particular goal, and that itself can create undue pressure. Now, it can be, in a sense, a helpful kick, I suppose, that we sometimes need. It is true that sometimes we're just not channeling our motivation in a useful way, and therefore to be able to say, okay, I need to have this competition with myself or with somebody else to be at a particular point, that can be something that gets us in gear. However, still recognizing it as a game of sorts is useful. You know, just because it's a game doesn't mean you can't be motivated. You don't have to tell yourself that the world ends if you lose here, unless, of course, the world does end, in which case you probably better get on it. But even in the case of very serious things, when we're really putting that pressure on ourselves, that too can backfire sometimes, because it can just put us into this fear mode, this fight or flight mode, this freeze mode, where we're not being very efficient and effective at what we're doing. Actually, a little playfulness can go a long way, even when something very serious is on the table. So that bit of lightness, I think, can be helpful if we are able to say, okay, well, yeah, let me have a friendly competition where, you know, if I'm a researcher, let's say, and other researchers are working on something for the good of humanity, and I look at that, as I do, and I say, oh, I kind of like some of their research. I like what they're doing. That maybe can inspire me to say, okay, it's not that I want to beat them, because I genuinely want them to do well at what they're doing. It's really, really good stuff that they're doing. And also, I can probably build on their research. I can reference them. They've done some great groundwork that I can then take forward in a different direction as per my specialization. So to be able to, though, feel maybe a little bit of positive competition there to go, oh yeah, okay, wow, let me draw on some of that energy and let me see now if I can help people even more or get good ideas out there a little bit more. So that mightn't be the worst thing, but still we're going to want to use it maybe consensually, purposefully, as a kind of a playful strategy rather than, oh no, I'm terrible and they're wonderful, and if I don't get to there, that's probably not going to be that useful motivationally. So I think it's that kind of distinction is helpful. Another really important thing when we're talking about competition is that there are what you could call different currencies at play. So somebody might say, well, okay, athletically, I'm winning. But somebody else may not be playing the athletic game. They might like reading. They might like gathering knowledge. And at that game, in terms of that currency, they're winning compared to the athletic side of things. The athletic person mightn't care about that. There are many, many currencies. Social popularity. How many likes you have on the social media platform of your choice. How many friends you have. How much money you have in the bank account. Many, 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 many currencies. Kind of infinite currencies, really. Now, truth be told, even for somebody who values a particular currency, even that person has many currencies. We don't always use one marker for our own self-worth in a given moment. There are normally several during any given day. However, we'll tend to see that we average, where our priorities lie, tends to average around certain specific topic areas. So again, like things like fitness or things like education or whatever else it might be. And again, that's not necessarily wrong, but where the caution is this question of equivalence. So if we are very, very good at something, but we happen to be in a community or by chance with a group of people who are very good at something else, the problem is we can have this feeling of losing the competition just from the get-go. And that can be very, very challenging then for us because we just, if we don't feel we can compete, if everybody else is great at basketball, but we're just able to play the violin, it's going to just seem like a complete non-starter. And the problem is very often we see other people deriving some sense of self-worth from the thing they're good at, and then we forget that they are actually maybe particularly skilled in that area, and we falsely or wrongly think that we need to be too in order to have worth, and that can create a whole host of problems. So considering that question of currency, I think, can be a really interesting thing to do. And it's a good reflective tool anyway in your life. What is your currency? What is it that rightly or wrongly you use as a kind of a stand-in for self-worth? You kind of externalize your self-worth and you go, well, if I'm good at this. And it's interesting because, that when we talk about basing self-worth on something, that can sound a bit negative. You could say, well, do I need to base it on anything? And no, you don't, by the way, is the answer. You can just be you and feel a sense of love and respect for who you are and for other people too by extension without needing it to be based on these particular metrics. But sometimes it can be a little subtle because what we can do is we can say, well, being kind to other people, that's my metric for my self-worth. So at a glance, that might sound better than something like money. Say, if I have enough money, then I'm worthwhile as a person. Most people would on the outside go, maybe that's not the healthiest. Okay, if you want money, fine. But, that shouldn't be a marker of your self-worth. We maybe want to take a different strategy there. But if somebody said, well, kindness to others, that's my metric for my self-worth. So you might look at that and you might say, that's a really good one. We really want that. We want to push in that direction. But still what it can lead to is this idea that I am unworthy unless I reach a certain number or a certain measure, albeit of the happiness of other people, which is a nice measure. But still, it's a bit of a problem because we can very often keep raising that number and just never really getting to the point of satisfaction then. It's like the carrot on the stick for the donkey. You're never quite reaching it. So you're not feeling satisfied within yourself. And then not only is that not nice for you, but that may well just make you less effective at actually caring for other people, which was your very metric to begin with. And something similar can happen with the money example. If you have to have money to be worthwhile as a person, it can lead to a couple of things. Sometimes it can lead to skipping other very important needs, such as good relationships with other people, in order to get that metric of money so that you can kind of tell yourself that you're worthwhile as a person, because that's how you constructed it. And that's, obviously not going to be a good enduring strategy. You might skip your health, you might skip your happiness, ironically, in order to have money, because then you tell yourself you're allowed to be happy. So that's going to be a poor strategy. But likewise, even with something more obviously benevolent like caring for other people, you're maybe going to want to switch the order around a little bit and say, actually, I'm not going to buy into this game of having to do X, Y, and Z in order to feel good. I'm going to start with feeling good And that then puts me in a good place to more playfully do X, Y, and Z. And then if you want to have one of these competitions, let's say you run a humanitarian organization and you care about the well-being of others, and Bob also runs a humanitarian organization, and Sarah also runs one too, and you're going, okay, how can we help the world better than each other? If that's taken in the spirit of playfulness, and you're kind of looking at each other and you want to kind of innovate and, you know, bounce ideas off each other, but still you really care about each other at the end of the day and you care about the mission, yeah, of course, a bit of competition there isn't bad at all. And certainly the opposite can happen. There can be a stagnancy if we're not trying to stretch and grow. And so we do need to own comparisons and judgment to a certain extent. You know, we do have as human beings the capacity to appraise things, to form comparisons, to compare and contrast. So we're probably not going to be able to get rid of that anyway. But even if we could, it wouldn't necessarily be a good idea. Better instead is to take that and to own it, to use it in a respectful way, to say, okay, do I care about something that actually matters? But even then, am I not just doing that in order to feel good, but am I feeling good in order to do that? And then certainly I can compare with other people, or I can compare and kind of have a positive competition to some degree with a version of myself in my own mind. That's not wrong to do. You know, if you think about a version of you who's maybe being a bit more efficient or a bit more effective, or even just kinder to yourself, and you go, okay, yeah, I want to win that competition a little bit more. And then you practice on that, but coming from that place of playfulness, then I think you're in a pretty good place with it. So do share your experiences with competition, whether it's worked for you or whether it's worked against you. Are you better off just letting go and feeling a bit of peace and not comparing yourself to other people or other versions of yourself at all? Or sometimes is it useful to actually draw some of those comparisons, but maybe in a light way, and to get a bit of inspiration as a result of doing that? Both probably have a role at some point or in another if we can find the balance. I keep coming across the idea of the middle path in Eastern philosophy. Is this something you'd recommend as a therapeutic approach? So the idea of a middle path is to suggest that balance essentially is a good idea, that rather than going to one extreme over here and the other extreme over there, that finding some sort of a path in the middle can hopefully integrate the different needs or the different drives we have or the different priorities that we might have in our life in a fairly useful way. So at its core, yes, I think is the quick answer. This is a good idea. It certainly is. To want balance and integration is useful. I think there's probably a distinction that we can make here that, particularly in a therapeutic context, can make that idea particularly useful or particularly practical. Because what you could do is you could misuse the idea of a middle path, and you could formulate it and construct it in a way that isn't actually that helpful, or may actually lead you very much astray. In fact, it could really backfire. So let's say you, for whatever reason, are a thief and you're about to rob somebody, and you go, okay, so should I just mug the person and take everything they have in their person? Or the other extreme, should I rob their entire home and take everything that they and their family have in the home? And you stop and you think, okay, let me take the middle path perhaps. Let me just choose a room and ransack that room and just take all of those items. So you can probably see the problem there with the way that's been formulated. A middle path is not maybe best constructed as just a center point between two arbitrary points that you've chosen, because you haven't really found balance there. You've just found a kind of fairly random center point between two positions which may themselves have been just different forms of extreme to begin with. And that's where I think the real caution is needed with an idea like a middle path, because a middle path may be a good idea, but it assumes that we've formulated or set up the poles appropriately to begin with, that there may be of equal value, and that we actually do want to find some sort of a path in the middle. So that's I think the caution, and that can go wrong. We do have to be careful with that. So if we're not looking for things like the robbery example, different extremes, how do we find our poles then, I suppose, is the question. And if you think about the Yin Yang symbol, which is one of the ways that this idea of balancing poles is often depicted, the Yin and Yang symbol, you've got the black and the white, but you got the little dot of black and the white and the little dot of white and the black. And the idea being there that actually these aren't separable things in a sense. They're two aspects of a system that are deeply interconnected with each other. So it's not really one versus the other. It's kind of like up and down, left and right. These things just go together as pairs essentially. There's a complementary relationship between them rather than two things that need to be adversarially opposed necessarily. Now, sometimes that can happen, but it hopefully doesn't happen, and it certainly doesn't need to happen. You can think about this, another piece of vocabulary is a dialogical approach to this, so that rather than one needing to win over the other, they're kind of in dialogue. There's a kind of a dance between each of them, and they actually energize and empower each other in some shape or form. So my go-to example often for this is the accelerator and the brake in a vehicle. So we can see there in that example that it certainly is possible to make them compete with each other. You can have the handbrake on or the foot brake down while you're accelerating, and there can be a kind of a push-pull going on, a waste of resources within the system. But certainly your aim there is not to then just get rid of one or the other. Your aim is to just use them as and when they're appropriate, essentially. And we'd appreciate that accelerating and braking can help the process of driving. It's not a question of one winning out of the other. They're both essentially positive things, but they're needed at different points. So that's, I think, the way we want to start thinking about what the poles are. Because, if we need a middle path, if we're trying to find a middle path, that presupposes we've got those poles to begin with to find a middle path between. So where we want to look towards, I think, a bit more are things like core needs, kind of fundamental principles, rather than just arbitrary topics that come up, like the robbery example. That's clearly highly unbalanced to begin with. Where maybe if we were using that example, we'd want to think of the extreme of robbery in one, and then the other extreme might be actually just giving everything that we have away. And we might say, well, is there a space in the middle where I'm not giving away everything, which is maybe not meeting my basic needs? And if my basic needs were met, I could actually help more people and maybe contribute more to the world than giving my possessions away. So it's not necessarily that simple, even if we just care about others. And then the other extreme is to take things that aren't ours in the spectrum, not so helpful. So the middle path there would be something in the middle of saying, okay, well, how can I maybe have what I have, but use it really well? You could actually give things away and do less good in the world than if you have the things you have, but you really use them in a very caring way as tools to support other people. So, we can see that might make more sense than as a middle path. And like the accelerator and the brake example, the middle path may vary a little bit where it is. It's more of a useful principle, I suppose, to guide us, because you may need to sometimes push a little bit to one direction, push a little bit to the other. But it's more like the idea of a pendulum, which kind of swings from side to side, but then kind of slowly stops and finds its balance. It's the idea of having that idea of a balance that you're almost magnetically pulled to, which I think can be fairly useful. One of the classic examples, and it comes up a huge amount therapeutically as a set of two poles, is the competition between safety on one hand and freedom on the other. So moving towards things and drawing back away from things are just such core fundamental aspects of being any living creature, not even just humans. It's a kind of a universal principle: progress and retreat. And that's one of the things we got to get good at doing, is knowing when to do each. It's not necessarily obvious, and certainly as kids we don't often get that right. We'll push towards things that maybe are dangerous for us, or then we'll pull back from opportunities, and it's a kind of a synchronization question, rather like learning to drive or learning to walk or learning to cycle, knowing when to do which. So that's a good example of core poles, because we can see that fundamental principles like freedom and safety, yeah, they're not going to go anywhere really. They're always going to be issues. So hopefully in a day-to-day sense, rather than just taking an arbitrary middle path between things that aren't really well adjusted, they're not really poles to begin with, maybe what we can do is we can say, well, yeah, what are my core needs here? We can find balances between things like connecting with other people and our own space, things like freedom and safety. And if we're looking at those core needs, then hopefully we're able to make a very well-informed decision as to what the middle path is, because it's a middle path that, like the Yin and Yang symbol, is kind of taking the best of both, and it's synthesizing them together in some way. There's an appropriate relationship, so you're meeting those needs as best you can. Now, it may involve, like walking. You're walking a little bit on the left foot, a little bit on the right foot, and that way you're moving back and forward. So you're kind of dancing around center. You're never really centered. You're always kind of moving a little off center, but that idea of the middle path that you're coming back to is rather useful. So something like that as an approach. People tell me I'm wise, but I don't feel wise. How can I connect with my inner wisdom? A distinction here, which is probably useful to make from the very beginning, is that having something is a rather different thing than noticing something. Where you could imagine having lots of money in the bank, but for whatever reason you forgot you had it. As unlikely as that might be, it could happen. There are plenty of things we might have but forget we have. You've probably had that experience where you have a widget of some description, but you kind of forgot you had one, and you go out and buy another one, and you come home and you find the one you already had, and you go, I had one of those already. So these are the kinds of things, in principle it's there. So with wisdom, if you think for just a moment, and it's actually a very interesting thing to do, is just to stop and think how much wisdom you have as a person, how much knowledge you have, how much experience you have. It's hard to even know how you'd go about quantifying it, because it's not something you can necessarily list. It's not what we call in psychology and cognitive psychology declarative. So when it comes to memory, that you can say, okay, I remember this specific thing. Some of it is facts and information, like Paris is the capital of France, things like that. Some of it is skill, though, just how to do a particular thing in a way that you're particularly good at doing. Some of it is things like balance while walking, things like riding bicycles. There's a whole bunch of stuff that would be very hard to even know how to catalog it. Even if you had all the time and the resources to do that, where would you even begin? So this leads to a problem, which is that in some ways, the wiser you are, we could say in some ways, the less you notice it. Now, you could say that, okay, you notice the effects of it, and that's true. So if you're very good at cycling, you'll probably notice that it's easy for you to cycle and you find yourself getting places. But often you won't notice that. So if you take walking, assuming you're comfortable enough in your walking, you tend not to notice you're walking that much, and that's kind of a good thing. The other classic example here is health. When you're very healthy, you don't tend to be thinking about health that much. Now, that's a really nice thing, because it means it's just working. Same with technology. You notice technology when it's not working. When it is working, it becomes invisible, isn't it? It's just this transparent thing that you use. You're typing, you're not thinking about the keys. You're driving, you're not thinking about the vehicle. You're walking, you're not thinking about your feet. It becomes invisible, incorporated in the language of phenomenology. So when that incorporation happens, the thing becomes sort of invisible. And things don't always start off that way. Very often it's very clunky at first. If we're learning to play an instrument or to drive or to type, there's a mass amount of overthinking. We weren't maybe conscious of it at all. Then we become aware that we can do the thing. We practice doing the thing, but we're still doing it rather consciously. And then it becomes what they often call an unconscious competence. So you're good at doing the thing, but you're not specifically thinking about the thing. You're just doing it. You're getting on with it. And that's great because that frees up your mental bandwidth then. So that means that as you're driving, you have more mental space. Now, the use for that mental space then is not to just go and think about totally non-related things and to distract yourself too much, but it's to have more free capacity to actually look at the road ahead. Because you wouldn't want to be driving, looking down at the gears or looking down at the pedals and where was that again. You want to make all of that unconsciously competent so that you're then free to just put your resources in being present and looking at what's happening ahead of you. And this is true in many other professions as well. Stand-up comedians would be a good example. People like me who do guided visualization work. When you practice actors, when you practice doing that, you do get in the zone very much while doing it. But what happens is you're able to think ahead a little bit then as well. Now, you're not thinking ahead about something non-related, but you're thinking about, okay, this feels right now. Now, where is the natural next step? Just like if you're going for a walk and you're enjoying each step, but you go, okay, now where will I turn next? So you're thinking a little bit ahead, whilst also connecting and grounding yourself in the experiencing that you're having in the present moment that you're in. So wisdom can be a little bit like that. We have lots of it very often, but as we accumulate it, we start to see it a little bit less. So it is nice to take a moment to notice some of that wisdom. And there's different ways of doing that. One is to just literally reflect, to stop for a moment and to breathe, and to feel a bit of gratitude for some of the abilities that you have, or to think back at some of the lessons you've learned in your life. And of course, this is a kind of a never-ending challenge. Your goal in doing this is not to try and list them all, and because you have a high number, therefore feel good. This is more like the process they use for quality control in factories, where rarely are they able to check every single item that comes off the belt. But what they will do is they will check the machines every so often, but then they'll pull out a random sample every so often. And they go, is that one okay? Yeah, looks good. Okay, happy with that. And then a while later, okay, take that one off the line. Is that okay? Yeah, okay, good. And in that way, they look for samples which kind of give an overall indicator of what's likely happening across the whole system. So you can do something similar. You might choose a few topic areas in your life. You might say, well, in terms of relationships, what's something I learned about relationships in my life? What's the insight that comes forward for me when I think about that? Because if I just ask you right now the question, what do you know? Not about relationships now, but just generally, what do you know? There's what we can call a search problem there, because we don't have any keywords. This is just too broad a question. You're typing nothing into a search engine. There's nothing to really prime it. There's no direction to guide it in. So that can be a real problem. So sometimes we need to break it down a little bit. You don't necessarily need to know the answer to the question that you're asking, but you need to know what the question is sometimes. So if you can say, okay, well, what wisdom do I have in terms of relationships? And maybe you want to get even more specific. What type of relationships? What have I learned about friendship in my life that matters? What have I noticed from other people? What have I noticed myself? What about health and wellness? My relationship with myself. What have I learned over the course of time about that? Just checking in on that. This maybe memories come forward. Or it mightn't even be a memory. It could just be a kind of a global idea, like a value. Something you go, yeah, I've recognized that, or maybe I'm good at that. Maybe I'm good at listening. Maybe I'm good at talking. That's valid too. And, of course, we can balance it. If we see anything that we think maybe needs a bit of work, you can do that work. But it's coming from a nice place, just a place of recognition. In terms of achieving things, you've achieved a lot in your life. Look, if you've made it this far and you're able to listen and understand half of this, something's working. You're able to speak languages, you're able to listen, you're able to operate technology enough to be able to even access these ideas. There's a lot working. There's an immeasurable amount working well. How did you get there? What's your secret? What are some of your strategies? So taking a moment to break that down and notice it can be really useful, and it might be something you want to do as a semi-regular technique. And again, it's not about any particular outcome. It's more just the act of looking inwards and recognizing some of what's there, which can be helpful. Another interesting thing is that sometimes self-concept gets in the way here. So we'll have this concept of who I am as a person. And because maybe we don't see ourselves as a wise person, ironically what can happen is sometimes if we don't see ourselves as a wise person, that encourages us to be constantly learning. But because we're constantly learning, we're becoming wise. But we forget to update our self-concept, that we now have wisdom. So we still maybe see ourselves as not knowing as much as other people. And the problem is that may be in an illusory way, that may be demonstrated to us, because you're probably going to meet somebody who knows all about certain music you don't, or has watched certain films you haven't, or has come across research you haven't. Inevitably, whatever the area is, they are able to bake something that you're not. It can be anything. And you go, oh. And in comparison to them, you notice the things you don't know. The stuff you do already know, you don't even see it. It becomes invisible to you. And so unfortunately, there's this kind of confirmation bias that you maybe don't have that wisdom, which just isn't really true. There's always going to be other stuff we can learn, but that doesn't mean you don't have an immense amount of wisdom to begin with. So sometimes the self-concept stops us from recognizing the wisdom. Now, this might matter sometimes. Maybe you can just use your wisdom and get on with your life and you're good. But sometimes it can cause problems, because sometimes we're not withdrawing some of the knowledge that we have in the bank account. We're not appreciating some of the wisdom that we have, and we're needlessly looking for it on the outside when in fact it was already there on the inside. Now, there may not be any harm in getting it from the outside as well. It can help us to grow and develop, but it's nice to recognize what's there and develop it, rather than ignore what's there and then seek it when in fact it was there to be developed in the first place. So one method you can play with here if you wish is just to stop for a moment and to imagine an inner teacher, a wise person of some description, and picture them any way you want. It might be like a character from a film, or it might be somebody who you know in your life who you consider particularly wise or learned, or whatever it might be. And just to take a moment and just imagine you're maybe in a room talking with that person, and you can ask them whatever you want. You know, one question, another question, another question. And when you do that, you might find some really interesting answers come up. You know, they give you some really profound wisdom. And what's really interesting about that is, of course, the other person wasn't in the room. You were the one who was imagining them. And that means that was your wisdom coming up. Now, you might say, well, I don't know if it was my wisdom. This was stuff I got from other people that I've learned. Yeah, that's still your wisdom. That's how it works. If you have it, if you've access to it, it's yours. Because knowledge is a bit like software. You know, in a sense, all software is someone else's software. You know, even if you design your own programs, still the operating system is probably built by somebody else. So it's always a shared commodity that we have. And that's what's nice about ideas. Generally, if you have a great idea and then somebody else has a great idea, usually you lose nothing by sharing it, because you still have your ideas. And even from the point of view of competition, that can actually be useful sometimes, because if other people start using good ideas as well, that often creates an ecosystem for those good ideas, so that they're doing it and you're doing it, and it's pro-social and you're helping each other, and you just create a nice environment to be in. So even on that perspective, it can be really useful. So it's interesting to maybe do that, to kind of imagine that inner teacher and just see what you're able to access. And it's just a simple demonstration of just how much wisdom you have. So if you notice that you have that wisdom, then you can say, well, actually, yeah, the problem isn't a lack of that. The problem is just not actually connecting with it, not recognizing that it's there and not using it well. So that's something that you might want to practice doing. Recognizing the wisdom that you have, thinking of examples of it, or if you do need to create the frame, a kind of a conceptual frame of another person or you in a teacher role, just to kind of look at it from that angle. And when you look at it from that angle, it's amazing what wisdom can bubble up, and you can recognize and appreciate it a bit more. All right, so we have time for one more topic before we start to wrap up for today. And this is an interesting and practical issue. Can you say something about the dangers of being honest? Speaking your mind seems like a good thing, but I know sometimes people don't take it well. Yeah, so there's a challenge here, isn't there? Because on the surface, the simple answer to this seems to be honesty, as they say, is the best policy. So what could be wrong with a bit of honesty? However, where's the point where the honesty sometimes actually becomes harmful, or even if it's well-intentioned, it just isn't received well, and there can be problems with that. So trying to find that line can be a little bit tricky. So one distinction we can start with immediately is that honesty, or an attitude of truthfulness, which, yeah, of course, as a default, I think we are going to want, is not the same as then necessarily communicating that thing that you're aware of. So there is a difference there. And just because of the sheer volume of information we're exposed to as human beings, we're going to need to filter anyway. We're always filtering. We're filtering what we put our attention on. If you're looking at this live or watching this video right now, there's plenty of other videos or streams you're not watching right now. That's just how attention works. We've got to disengage from certain things and prioritize and engage in something that hopefully is the more valuable choice for us in that moment. And that may change then in a different moment. There's something else we're going to focus on. So it's nice to recognize that we are already filtering to some degree anyway. So this is nothing to do with lying or with being truthful. It's just a question that we have a limited amount of resources and we place them in a certain area. So if you are interacting with another person and if there's something about them you notice, okay, that doesn't have to be the only aspect of them you notice. You may see a problem that they have, something bad or something you dislike about them, okay. But there probably are also many good things, other aspects of them that you can appreciate as well in that moment. So immediately it's not as simple as, okay, we see the bad thing and then we communicate the bad thing. We may see the bad thing but not communicate it. We'll talk about that in a moment. But we may also see the bad thing but also say, well, what other things are there as well, though? And let's maybe, for balance, look at some of those things and recognize them. So doing that is not being in any way dishonest. You could say it's dishonest either way. To ignore the good will be dishonest. To ignore the bad would be dishonest. We probably want a bit of a zoomed out view to be able to see everything that's on the table. But then to question in that moment, how pertinent are any of those flaws or difficulties in that moment? And this is where the second step comes in, communication. So recognition is the first thing. Communication or action based on the recognition is the second step. And is that a good idea? So we do want to get our facts straight, because jumping to assumptions isn't good. So taking the moment to be a bit present, making sure that we're not too emotionally invested in it being a particular way, stepping back and seeing the wood for the trees and recognizing what's happening is useful. Should we then call it out? Yeah, sometimes we should. If it's a situation where we are the appropriate person to call it out, we're likely to be effective in calling it out, then yes. Should we call it out if it hurts the other person's feelings? Well, sometimes we may have to if there's danger involved. If somebody lit a campfire and it started to spread and take down the forest, you're probably going to want to draw their attention to that, even if they feel rather guilty or rather upset for the fact that they have done that. But you can see that one of the really important bits of this communication is that this then isn't coming from a place of being out to get the other person. There's a sense of a greater good which we're genuinely trying to achieve. Now, of course, any of these points can get controversial, because, one person can think that, mocking another person is for the greater good because that person's just a nasty person and they want the world to know it. And the other person maybe doesn't think what they've done is actually wrong to begin with. So these are the gray areas where it gets complicated. But this doesn't change any of these ideas, because we're still going to be statistically in a much better place if we're stepping back, seeing the wood for the trees, and actually looking truthfully at what's happening. And then we're questioning, okay, should I communicate? And by me communicating, is this in the best interest of the person, of me, of others, of the world or the environment you're in? And then if so, the follow-on is, okay, then if I have kind of a license to communicate, what's the best way of communicating? Should I say it directly to the person? Maybe I actually need to say it to someone else who can kind of translate it to them, because it's going to come from a better place if that other person hears it. So good relationships are part of this, and sometimes we're going to have such a poor relationship with another person that even if there is something that we really need to change, we're not really going to change if it comes from us, just because of the history that's there. Sometimes we just need to own that, and we need to communicate with other people instead, and that's a better way of structuring it. The other thing as part of that relationship idea as well is kind of balancing feedback over time as well. Because, if you're always just shouting out problems the whole time, realistically, the other person is going to get desensitized to you, even if you're right, by the way. Even if this person is just constantly causing problem after problem, they're just going to assume, I suppose, a negativity. And for some people, that leads them to shut down and be less receptive. So there's different strategies. One communication strategy that's sometimes used in leadership training is what's called a compliment sandwich. So it's something along the lines of, hey, Bob, I've noticed you're really, really good at A. Really great to see that. Look, with B, any chance you could do a bit of work on that and improve it? But by the way, with C, you're great at that and really nice to see that. So that kind of a formula. Now, that might be a bit formulaic, but, you can take the principle of that even if you don't literally use it in that direct a way. But the idea there of mixing in compliments is useful. And, you could argue that one as well. And you could say, well, why does somebody need a compliment? Well, is this an egotistical issue? Do they need to be validated? Surely if something's doing something wrong, if they're doing something wrong, you call them on that and you say, Bob, you're doing something wrong. Sarah, you've messed up. Is that not fair enough? And sometimes you do have a relationship with them where that will almost be playful, even though the information is valid, and somebody will take that okay. But it's all down to having that relationship and knowing that you do have that relationship if that's how you do communicate. But I think the reason for being able to give those compliments is actually less about stroking the ego, although that is needed. I mean, we have egos to some degree. We have to have a form of communication that takes that into account for the average person during a busy day. We can't just bypass that. But the reason why it's important, I think, is because very often what the compliments are a demonstration of caring. They're a kind of a mark of goodwill, that you are genuinely somebody who wishes well for the other person. And that is a critical part of communication anyway, but it's an especially more critical part of communication if it's critical communication. If you're trying to be honest and draw somebody's attention to something, and if you actually want or expect change to happen. So you don't necessarily need to say it in so many words, but I think we want your tone of voice, your track record, your history with this person, and the constructive way in which you're speaking to essentially say, you are really, really capable and able, and giving you this feedback in the spirit of making sure that you can really function at your very best. That's the kind of the tone or the mode that we want to come from. Now, it's not always, as I say, going to be possible for you to say that and for it to come across in a meaningful and authentic way. Sometimes you have history with the person, it just doesn't work. It's like, even in interrogations, police interrogations, the old good cop, bad cop strategy. There's a reason why they have two cops doing that. Because if you're the really harsh interrogator and then suddenly you're really nice and you keep switching, that's rather unsettling for the person being interrogated. It doesn't really work as a strategy. It's because we do project. We form a kind of a concept of a person. And again, sometimes that history just gets in the way. And this is true even of positive relationships. It can be rather hard sometimes for somebody to be maybe your employer and your best friend and your mother and several other roles. It's not that any of these are right or wrong. They could all be very positive relationships, but they're just different modes or different dynamics, so they could be kind of hard to bridge. So what to speak of if you're trying to give criticism to a person and there's history there that can be a bit of an issue? You still may need to do it, and still you'll probably do well to have that sense of respect as much as is possible, but sometimes it may be necessary to get other people involved. But it's a great topic area, and that idea of being honest is definitely important. But think of honesty, think of a genuine awareness of what's going on, then think of whether communication is appropriate and helpful, and then maybe think of how that can best be achieved. So if you're being reflective in that way, that's probably going to get you a lot further than not. So, what are your experiences with honesty? Has it backfired on you despite your good intentions? Are you somebody who's honest to a fault, or are you somebody who actually just likes to keep your mouth shut and try and get through the day? There's merits to all strategies. Like everything else, it's probably about finding the balance of knowing when to do what, which, like learning to walk or learning to drive or type or play a musical instrument, can only come with practice and a bit of reflection. All right, so those are our topics for today. Thank you so much to everybody who sent them in. They're great. So as always, you can send in your topics and questions for upcoming calls. So please do send them in. So let us take, just before we wrap up for today, let's take a moment, if you have a moment, to simply stop. And if you don't have a moment, no problem. Come back to this later when you do have more space. But if you do have some room, you might want to stop and just enjoy a nice conscious deep breath in. That's it, just letting your breathing relax. So you enjoy the feeling of being a bit more present in a very simple way, a very meaningful way. And as you look ahead then, through the coming hours, the coming days, you can see yourself maybe embracing a playful relationship with competition. Can you maybe use comparison sometimes to your advantage in a way that positively inspires you? But more as a way of reminding you of what you're capable of, rather than telling you that you're lacking something. Go, oh yeah, I forgot I could do that. Just bringing your attention inwardly and noticing that and feeling maybe a bit excited about that. And as you're navigating in a day-to-day sense, what does it practically mean for you to do a good job of finding the middle path? So not just choosing a random center point between two things which aren't really poles, but actually maybe noticing complementary needs within you. The need maybe to be active, but also the need to rest. And say, well, what's the middle path for me? How do I find balance in that sense over time? Just maybe see what that means for you in your life. And as with all of these things, not a question of necessarily mastering them, because what does it mean to master balance? You know, you're always going to be going a bit to one direction, a bit to the other direction. That never stops. It never ends. But you get good at doing that. You get good at moving between those points and finding that balance more instinctively. And really appreciating just how wise you are, how much life experience you have, and being excited by that. Maybe remembering moments of wisdom, looking at themes, areas of your life where you can maybe notice some of the wisdom that's there. Or maybe imagining that idea of an inner teacher, somebody who can give you some important life lessons. And when you listen to those life lessons, and this happens sometimes just when you speak as well, you go, oh, I didn't know I knew that. You're learning from listening to yourself. And that's because what it is really for you to be you as a person is to be this center point where all of these different ideas just resonate and come together. Just like a room in which different musicians play, and there's the kind of sum total of that music which comes together as a song. In the same way, that wisdom, regardless of where it came from, it resonates in you, and it has its own particular quality. And you're really noticing that you have that, and you can feel excited by that. And also, as you look through the hours and days ahead, embracing that spirit of honesty. But just as you recognize what's happening, you're also choosing where you're putting your attention, when you're communicating, and how you're communicating. And you're feeling that sense of commitment to communicating in ways that are particularly compatible with the well-being of others and the well-being of you, the well-being of the world that you're in. So just allow some of those feelings to resonate within you. Just setting you up, putting you in a good place for the coming hours and days ahead. And you might enjoy a nice deep breath in. And just relaxing your body and bringing your attention clearly and presently back to this moment, right here and right now. All right. Thank you very much for being here at this session. And if you found it valuable, please do like, subscribe, and share to anybody who might find it useful. And remember, you can send in your topic suggestions, your questions, your comments. You can do that in the comment section or using hashtag bodymindself on social media or directly at jfl.com. So I'm back next Thursday at 8 p.m. GMT, here every Thursday at 8 p.m. So do tune in then. And between now and then, take great care.